Most people assume retirement problems begin when someone fails to save enough money, but after looking at enough retirement stories, you realize that's often not what happens at all. Some people reach retirement with very little. Others arrive with several $100,000. A few cross the $1 million mark. Yet money worries can show up in all three groups. The difference is usually not the size of the account. It's whether the person understands what that money is expected to do over the next 20 or 30 years. That's where things get complicated, because there comes a point when retirement starts looking secure from the outside, even when important cracks are beginning to form underneath. And those cracks can remain invisible for a very long time. A man named Gary learned that the hard way. After more than 30 years of working, saving, and generally doing what financial experts tell people to do, he met with an advisor to review his retirement plan. The meeting wasn't supposed to be dramatic. He wasn't expecting bad news. He simply wanted reassurance that everything looked healthy. Instead, he discovered there was a significant gap between the retirement he imagined and the retirement his savings could realistically support. The surprise wasn't that he had made mistakes. It was that he hadn't made many. That's why this topic matters. The retirement mistakes that cause the most damage are rarely the obvious ones. Most don't feel dangerous while they're happening. Some even feel responsible. Today we're looking at 9 of the most common examples, and chances are at least one of them will feel familiar. 1. The number that lies. A retirement account balance can be strangely comforting. You open a statement and see a number that's larger than it was last year. Maybe much larger. For a moment, everything feels reassuring. The problem is that retirement balances tell only part of the story. Imagine two people with identical portfolios worth $600,000. One plans to spend very little in retirement. The other expects a much more expensive lifestyle. Even though the balances are identical, their situations are completely different. That's because retirement isn't really about the amount of money you've accumulated. It's about the income that money can generate and how long it has to last. Consider someone who retires at 65 and lives into their mid-80s. That portfolio may need to support 2 decades of spending, possibly longer. Once healthcare costs, inflation, taxes, and unexpected expenses enter the picture, a balance that once felt impressive can start looking much less comfortable. This is where many people get caught off guard. They spend years focused on growing the account. Very little time is spent asking a more important question. What exactly is this money supposed to accomplish? A retirement balance isn't the destination. It's the fuel. And unless you understand how much fuel the journey requires, the number itself can be misleading. 2. The tax illusion. One of the most surprising conversations many retirees have involves money they thought was already theirs. For decades, retirement savings often grow inside tax-deferred accounts. The arrangement feels simple enough. You receive a tax break while working. The government collects its share later. The issue is that later eventually becomes today. A retiree may look at a $700,000 account and naturally think in terms of having $700,000 available. But retirement doesn't work that neatly. What matters is not the account balance. It's the amount you can actually spend after taxes. That distinction becomes more important as withdrawals begin. And eventually many retirees face required withdrawals whether they need the money or not. At that point, decisions become more complicated. Taxes influence timing. Timing influences flexibility. And flexibility becomes one of the most valuable assets a retiree can have. None of this means tax-deferred accounts are bad. Far from it. The challenge is assuming every dollar shown on a statement belongs entirely to you. Retirement tends to be much smoother when people understand the difference between what they own and what they can ultimately spend. 3. The silent leak. Some financial mistakes are obvious. Others are almost invisible. Fees fall into the second category. Most people don't notice them because they rarely arrive as a bill in the mail. Instead, they quietly reduce returns in the background, year after year. Imagine filling a bucket with water while a tiny hole sits near the bottom. The bucket still fills. Water continues to rise. At first glance, everything appears fine. The problem is that some of the water never stays in the bucket. Investment fees often work the same way. Sandra discovered this while reviewing an account she had owned for years. The balance had grown. Nothing seemed unusual. Then she took a closer look at what she was paying. The percentage appeared small. But after running the numbers, she realized those costs had quietly consumed a meaningful amount of her long-term growth. That's what makes fees so deceptive. Nobody feels the impact in a single month. The effect becomes visible only after years of compounding. By then, the money is gone. A good retirement plan isn't only about earning more. It's also about keeping more of what you earn. 4. The timing trap. There's a phrase often used in investing: the market eventually recovers. Historically, that's been true. What people don't talk about as often is whether the investor has enough time to wait for that recovery. For someone in their 30s, a major market decline can be frustrating. For someone approaching retirement, it can alter the timeline of their life. Robert experienced this during the financial crisis. Like millions of others, he watched his retirement portfolio decline sharply. The numbers were difficult to look at, but what stayed with him wasn't the loss itself. It was the realization that retirement would need to wait. A few more working years, a few more postponed plans, a few more years before the life he had spent decades preparing for could begin. Eventually, the portfolio recovered. Many portfolios did. But time works differently. Once it's gone, there isn't a recovery period. This is why retirement investing becomes a balancing act. Too much risk can create damage at exactly the wrong moment. Too little risk creates a different problem. Inflation keeps moving, regardless of what markets are doing. A retirement that may last 20 or 30 years still requires growth. The goal isn't finding a perfect investment strategy. The goal is building one that's appropriate for the stage of life you're in. Because retirement doesn't just test how much money you've saved. It tests whether that money can withstand the timing of real life. Up to this point, most of these mistakes have had something in common. They grow quietly. Nobody gets a letter in the mail saying they're falling behind. There's no alarm, no obvious warning. Life simply moves forward. And then one day, people realize a decision they barely thought about years ago is still affecting them today. The next few examples tend to hit particularly hard because they influence income, spending, and flexibility all at the same time. 5. The $100,000 decision. There aren't many decisions in retirement that continue paying consequences month after month for the rest of your life. When to claim Social Security is one of them. What makes it difficult is that the choice often arrives at exactly the moment people are getting tired of waiting. After decades of work, the idea of finally receiving benefits feels natural. For some people, claiming early is absolutely the right move. But many others make the decision without fully understanding what they're giving up. Mike retired at 62. The extra income helped immediately. There was no sense that he had made a mistake. In fact, the decision felt practical. The issue didn't appear until much later. As the years passed, everyday costs kept rising. Property taxes rose. Insurance premiums rose. Healthcare costs rarely moved in the right direction. Yet the choice Mike made years earlier stayed with him. Every monthly check reflected that decision. That's easy to overlook when you're thinking about the next few years. It's much harder to ignore when you're thinking about the next 20. One of the strange things about retirement is that small monthly differences can become very large, lifetime differences. That's why this decision deserves more attention than it often receives. People spend months researching vehicles they'll own for 5 years. Yet some make a lifetime income decision after only a brief conversation. 6. The hidden giant. If you ask people to picture retirement expenses, most don't immediately think about healthcare. They imagine travel, family visits, golf, fishing, maybe the kitchen renovation they've postponed for years. Healthcare tends to stay in the background, at least until it doesn't. One reason retirement planning can feel misleading is that many expenses remain optional. You can delay a vacation, postpone a purchase, scale back a project. Healthcare doesn't usually offer that flexibility. When your doctor recommends a treatment, you're not negotiating the way you might with a new car. And healthcare costs don't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes they accumulate so gradually that people barely notice the change. A prescription becomes 2 prescriptions. Annual appointments become more frequent. Specialists enter the picture. New medications get added. Nothing seems catastrophic on its own. But over time, the financial impact becomes impossible to ignore. I've heard retirees describe this experience almost the same way. They planned for retirement. What they didn't fully plan for was aging, and those are not necessarily the same thing. A retirement plan can look solid for years. Then a health issue changes the math. Not overnight, but steadily. That's why healthcare has a way of exposing weaknesses that remained hidden while everything was going smoothly. 7. The missed window. There is a period in life that often passes without much attention while it's happening. Then people look back and realize how much opportunity it contained. For many, that's their 50s. Retirement is close enough to feel real. Earnings are often near their peak, and the financial pressure of raising children may finally be easing. On paper, it's an ideal time to strengthen retirement savings. In reality, many people experience something different. After years of hard work, they finally have more room in the budget. Naturally, they want to enjoy it, and there's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that lifestyle upgrades have a way of becoming permanent. A larger monthly payment here, a recurring expense there, a few decisions that don't seem particularly significant. Then 10 years pass. One thing I've noticed is that retirement setbacks rarely come from obviously reckless behavior. Most people know when they're doing something extreme. The bigger risk is becoming slightly more comfortable every year without realizing how much that comfort costs over time. That's what makes this stage of life so important. Money invested at 58 doesn't have the same amount of time as money invested at 38. But it still matters. A great deal. Because the years leading into retirement often determine how much flexibility exists after retirement begins. And flexibility is one of the few things people almost never regret having more of. 8. No exit plan. Most conversations about retirement focus on building wealth. Much less attention is given to what happens after the paychecks stop. Yet that's where an entirely different set of decisions begins. David spent years preparing for retirement. He contributed consistently, avoided major financial mistakes, built a portfolio that looked healthy on paper. By the time he retired, he had accumulated close to $900,000. Friends assumed he was in excellent shape. David assumed the same. What he hadn't spent much time considering was how the money would actually be used. Which accounts should be tapped first? Which accounts should be left alone? How would taxes affect those decisions over the next 10 or 15 years? Those questions seem technical, easy to postpone. But retirement has a way of turning small decisions into recurring ones. A withdrawal made this year influences next year, and the year after that. Over time, David realized he had been creating unnecessary tax costs simply because there was no framework guiding his choices. Nothing dramatic happened. No crisis. No market collapse. No disastrous investment. Just a slow stream of money leaving his retirement plan that didn't need to leave. That's easy to miss because most people spend decades learning how to accumulate assets. Retirement asks something different. It asks how efficiently those assets can support a life. And those are not always the same skill. 9. The real enemy. After everything we've discussed, many people still assume the greatest retirement threat is the market itself. History paints a different picture. Markets have always been unpredictable. Booms arrive, declines arrive, recoveries arrive. That's never been the unusual part. What changes outcomes is often what happens between the decline and the recovery. A person spends 30 years building a retirement portfolio. Then, one difficult year arrives. The headlines become impossible to ignore. Every conversation seems to revolve around uncertainty. The future suddenly feels less certain than it did a few months earlier. And under those conditions, even disciplined investors begin questioning decisions they felt comfortable with for decades. It's a very human response. Nobody enjoys watching account balances fall. Nobody enjoys uncertainty. But retirement investing demands patience during periods when patience feels least natural. Looking back, many retirees can identify a handful of decisions that shaped their financial future. Sometimes those decisions involved buying a home, changing careers, starting a business. Other times, the defining moment was much quieter. A decision made during a stressful week. A decision made out of fear. A decision that felt temporary at the time, but produced consequences that lasted for years. The market eventually moves on. What often lingers is the choice people made while emotions were in control. The retirement balance that created a false sense of security, the taxes hiding behind future withdrawals, the fees that quietly reduced growth, the risk that arrived at the wrong moment, the social security decision that followed someone for decades, the healthcare costs that changed the equation, the years when earning power was highest, but opportunity slipped away, the absence of a withdrawal strategy, and the emotional decisions that appeared during difficult markets. None of these mistakes are unusual. That's exactly why they're worth paying attention to. One thing becomes clear after listening to enough retirement stories. Very few people arrive at retirement believing they've ignored something important. Most genuinely think they're doing the right things. They're saving, working, planning, making thoughtful decisions. And for the most part, they are. The surprises tend to come from places they never thought to examine closely. A fee that seemed insignificant, a benefit claimed a few years earlier, a tax consequence nobody explained clearly, a health issue that changed the numbers, a decision made during a stressful moment. Looking back, those events rarely appear dramatic, yet they often become the details people remember most. Maybe that's because retirement isn't really a financial event. Not entirely. It's a life transition. And life rarely changes because of one massive turning point. More often, it changes through a series of ordinary choices that accumulate over time. The encouraging part is that accumulation works both ways. A small mistake repeated for years can create problems. A small improvement repeated for years can create freedom. So if something from this video stayed with you, don't worry about fixing everything. Most people can't. Instead, pay attention to the issue you recognized immediately, the one that made you pause for a second, the one that felt familiar. Those moments are usually worth listening to because retirement isn't determined by a single decision. It's shaped by hundreds of them. Many have already been made, but some are still ahead of you, and those may matter more than you think. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take care, and I'll see you next time.